Good afternoon and welcome to this panel discussion on the bamboo ceiling hosted by the Leadership Futures Hub at the Deakin Business School. My name is Lee Martin and I'm looking forward to moderating this session. Now, before we begin, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. As we gather for this event, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, let us take a moment to reflect the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging, of all the land we work and live on, and their ancestral spirits, with gratitude and respect. And I would like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri tribe of the Kulin Nation, who have been the traditional custodians for 40,000 years of the land that I am on. So I'm delighted to see that so many of you have made time to be with us tonight to just discuss this bamboo ceiling topic. And before we move on to introduce the panelists, I'd like to open with a few remarks on this topic. So the bamboo ceiling is a term that you may or may not be so familiar with. It refers to factors that can hinder people from Asian backgrounds from progressing into senior leadership positions in Western organisations. And really it gets to the issue of cultural diversity, or the lack of cultural diversity in leadership. So this is a really relevant issue in Australia, given our multicultural society. 30% of Australians were born overseas, and increasingly that's from Asian countries. And that's not to mention the number of Australians born in Australia with one or two parents who were born overseas. So clearly we're a very culturally diverse society, and that should be reflected in who is leading our organisations, yet it's not. So this has something to do with the bamboo ceiling, right? So as recent reports have shown over the past 5 years or so, the bamboo ceiling is real, it does exist. People from ethnic backgrounds in Australia, in Australian workplaces, face particular challenges, and they are underrepresented at senior leadership levels in Australian workplaces in many sectors. So these reports, as I said, over the past 5 years or so, have raised awareness of this issue of the bamboo ceiling, cultural diversity in leadership, but there's still so much more to be done about actually addressing this problem. So one of the problems is that when we talk about diversity, actually we still often have this tendency to talk about gender diversity and the glass ceiling, while overlooking cultural diversity and the bamboo ceiling. So I think that there was one thing that I came across on social media the other day, which really illustrated this point to me. So I'm going to show you this image that I came across. This is political candidates, and I wonder what you think of when you look at this image, whether you think it's very diverse or not, because on Twitter, there was a mixture of responses to this image. So on the one hand, some people were really excited that there's greater representation of women in this image, which is a great thing. However, the cultural diversity is missing in this image, right? And a lot of people pointed that out. So it was really obvious to some people. And I think that this, was a very stark reminder to me that as we make progress on gender diversity and the glass ceiling, we need to remember to keep taking actions to also try to address the bamboo ceiling at the same time and not leave that behind. So, this is a really important problem to address because the bamboo ceiling holds back more than culturally diverse employees. I mean, obviously, they feel the direct effects in terms of having their career potential limited, but beyond that, there's also other people who are affected by the bamboo ceiling. So other leaders in the organisation, for example, if they are not able to work with leaders who are culturally diverse, who bring culturally diverse perspectives, they miss out on these richer exchanges and the learning that can come from that. Another example of who else misses out is the next generation of Asian Australian leaders or employees, because they don't have these role models and these mentors who are occupying senior leadership positions who look like them, who can inspire them and who can guide them to become future leaders. And then you have organizations which, ultimately they lose out by not having more diverse leadership teams, because more diverse leadership teams, we know that they enhance decision-making quality, enhance innovation, and can improve firm performance as well. So this is clearly a problem that we need to address. So the question is how to address it, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. So we're looking at the bamboo ceiling problem from the perspective of Asian Australian leaders. And we're asking, what are the challenges that they face? Why don't we see more Asian Australian leaders? And what can we do? What can individuals and what can organizations do to address the bamboo ceiling? So we are very fortunate to have a wonderful set of panelists tonight. We have 4 panelists, and they'll be sharing their personal reflections on these questions. So allow me to introduce the panelists. They are from across corporate, education, and government sectors, and they've all been bestowed the honour of being named among the 40 under 40 most influential Asian Australians this year. And that's an award that's part of the Asian Australian Leadership Summit. So I will introduce them each in alphabetical order. So firstly, Dr. Seiji Armstrong is the head of machine learning, trust, and safety engineering at Google. And prior to that, he led a data team at Silicon Valley in a startup, protecting Fortune 100 banks and retailers from sophisticated cyber attacks. He holds a PhD in quantum physics and has been awarded the Australia Asia Prime Minister's Award for Outstanding Research. Next is Charisma Kalyanda, who is an elected councillor for Liverpool City Council and the Community Engagement Officer for Headspace Campbelltown, advocating for young people's mental health and well-being. Charisma is one of only 11 women elected to council in Liverpool's 144-year history, and she's one of the youngest, and she's named one of Australia's rising political stars by Marie Claire magazine. Stanley Wang is the principal of Abbotsford Primary School, and prior to this, he was the CEO of Teach for Taiwan and the head of languages at Haileybury. He's a dedicated ambassador for language learning and intercultural capability. Stanley has served and continues to serve on numerous educational advisory boards around the world. And finally, Gloria Yoon. Gloria is the head of regulatory response at NAB and also the chair of NAB's Cultural Inclusion Employee Resource Group. She describes herself as a risk management evangelist who infuses inclusion and diversity principles in effective risk management, strategy and innovation, and corporate governance. And Gloria also volunteers with several women's organisations to help grow the talent pipeline and amplify the voices of women of all cultural backgrounds. So thank you all for joining us. So we're now going to have a discussion with the panel for the first 45 minutes or so, and then in the remaining time, we'll ask the panelists questions that you may have submitted prior or that you submit during the Q&A, via the Q&A box during this session. Okay, so let's move on to the questions. We'll start with some general questions for everyone on the panel to respond to. And so something simple, just at first, could you tell us about your cultural background? Just take a couple of minutes for these questions. Tell us about your cultural background and also share your perception of the bamboo ceiling in your sector. So do you see that there's a lack of cultural diversity in leadership in your sector? And is that a big or an entrenched problem? And what are some consequences that you might see coming from that? Can we start with, we'll go in alphabetical order. And so we'll start with Seiji, please.
Got it. Thank you, Lee. Hi, everyone. I'm Seiji, as Lee mentioned. My cultural background, I'm half Japanese, half Australian. I was born in Australia, went to preschool and a bit of elementary school in Japan. And we moved back to Australia when I was about 8, when my father, my Australian father, who never quite learned Japanese, couldn't speak to me anymore in English, and we couldn't hold a conversation. So we moved the family back to Australia. The bamboo ceiling and implications. I might dodge the question of bamboo ceiling in Australia and talk more about the consequences of lack of cultural diversity in my sector, which is tech. And the reason I'm taking this route is for the last 5 years, I've been in California working for tech companies in Mountain View in Silicon Valley. And in America and California, race relations are quite different to what they are in Australia. It's really at a tipping point, as we've seen with movements like Black Lives Matter. Coming back to tech, so publicly available numbers can reveal that it is a huge problem that we have a lack of cultural diversity in leadership positions across the board. I can speak to what I see in my company and other companies in terms of the consequences. So when we have a lack of voices and people representing different cultures, when we develop products and services in tech that, keep in mind, go out to billions of users across the world from all over the place. When these voices aren't in the conversation, then it's possible that the products and services that are being developed they have that bias of whoever is developing those products and services, typically white men. They have those biases encoded into them. And so you can imagine when a phone is developed, or there's facial or object or speech recognition algorithms that are being developed, if they're not trained on diverse voices and use cases, they won't be equitable for all users. And so that's a huge consequence across the board.
Fantastic, thank you. That's a really good point. Charisma, and then we'll go with Stanley and then Gloria.
Thanks, Lee, and hi everyone. I'm Charisma. First of all, it's probably worthwhile sort of introducing you all to Liverpool to give you a little bit of context to sort of answer that question. Well, my family, like most of the people within my community, I'm a migrant. I was born overseas in Bangalore, India, which is sort of the tech capital of India. And my immediate family migrated to Australia when I was about 4 years old in sort of the early 90s. And that's reflective of the stories of a lot of people within my community. Liverpool is one of the most multicultural parts of Australia. We have people from over 120 different countries who have made this place their home. And we have over 150 different languages that are spoken in various households. And in that way, Liverpool's sort of a reflection of the various layers of migration to Australia. And we have people that are in various stages of their migration journey as well. Unfortunately, our political representation doesn't really reflect that diversity, that richness within our broader community. And this isn't an issue just for Liverpool. We know from the statistics and from recent conversations that lack of cultural diversity is an issue that's facing many local, state and federal sort of levels of government. And that is really affecting how people are able to live their lives. I strongly believe that government matters because it affects the way that people live their lives every single day. For us here in Liverpool, we were one of the 12 local government areas of concern during the most recent sort of lockdown and restrictions. And so for about 107 days, our residents experienced some of the harshest restrictions in the country, in the world really. And so we were able to see the value and also the failures of government inaction during that period of time, where when the government would release a series of restrictions or measures, they didn't really factor in the way that various culturally diverse communities communicated with each other, the way that they accessed information, the way that they accessed support, and also the impact of fear on those communities. And so it was left to local representatives largely, as well as not-for-profits, friends, neighbours, and others to really fill that gap and sort of assist where government was not able to provide that reassurance, to provide that support. And that will also play a huge factor in the recovery process. We have a very long way to go, given I think we're about a week into freedom at the moment. We have a very long way to go. And as the new sets of restrictions, new measures are starting to roll out, there will be a gap between how the government thinks communities play and to play out and interact with each other versus how they actually do, and that gap can be a significant one, and it really affects the way that that people are able to live their lives. So I see that as a huge drawback for the lack of diversity in government, various levels of government in Australia.
Absolutely, thank you, Charisma. Stanley.
Hi everyone, my name is Stanley, and like Lee introduced, I'm the principal at Abbotsford Primary School in Melbourne. My cultural background is that I always say that I'm Taiwanese Australian. I was born in Taiwan, and my family moved here in 1998. And I was really lucky to have then completed my primary schooling and all the way until university here, and have stayed. I think the perception of bamboo ceiling issue for education, and I think before I can answer that, I need to, I guess, clarify a little bit. I think the issue I'm particularly passionate about in addressing within education is within the school sector. I think education is very big as an industry, and there's the diversity of situations from higher education all the way down to early childhood is very, very different. But within our mainstream schools, certainly, I think the problem is quite entrenched. I think we're probably one of the industries that's so behind that these figures are not even publicly available yet, or even published or talked about. And to be honest, it's something I've been reflecting on since my start of my principalship 12 months ago, because growing up here, I have enjoyed the cultural diversity Australia naturally comes with as an kind of an immigrant destination. But I have never walked into, I guess, principal level meetings where I stand out so much, and I was joking with my own reporting line the other day, because the principal session a couple of months ago was on the benefits of a therapy dog, and the only non-white existence in that room was me and the therapy dog. I could look around the whole place, and it felt unreal. It didn't feel like Australia, because the Australia I knew, going to the shops, the supermarkets, the restaurants, anywhere you walk around, that diversity is always there. But it's certainly not in the case for our school sector. So I think what are some of the consequences is we tend to see where diversity in education does exist in the school kind of age group is always outside of the school, in your community schools, language schools, weekend schools, now commercialized tutoring services. That's where you get the diversity. And so one of the consequences of the school sector, the mainstream school sector, not addressing it is that this dichotomized situation becomes worse. There's some sort of self-fulfilling almost prophecy, with people now naturally thinking this place doesn't belong to me, so I belong to the outside of school category. And certainly I think this in and out mentality is not healthy. And I also think, like Lee mentioned, education is responsible for the prosperity of the nation and really our next generation. And so if there is no inspiration and no role model for them to feel that education or school teaching is a valid pathway, then how do we expect this problem to be solved? Because education often stands in the root of the kind of future we want to see. So I see this as a particularly urgent issue to be addressed.
Yes, very true about education being where it all begins. So thanks, Stanley. And Gloria.
Well, thanks, Stanley. Couldn't agree more. So hi, everyone. I'm Gloria. Thanks for having me. I'm also standing on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, similar to Lee, and I would like to join Lee and others in paying my respects to the traditional custodians to begin with. A few things about me. I was born and raised in Hong Kong under British rule, so born with 3 passports in a very traditional Chinese family. So I'm the first in my generation to go to university, and of course I was expected to be a doctor, lawyer, accountant, or banker. And I chose law and ended up with a career in banking. And then further to that, I married a German man, which made us the first mixed race couple in my family as well. And I've lived and worked in Singapore, Shanghai, Europe, Hong Kong before migrating to Australia in 2016 with NAB as my sponsor to really take up a global role. So I would describe myself as just a modern, global, regular Australian, living in Australia with Chinese ancestry. And I absolutely agree with all the consequences, that are shared by, all the panelists. And to me, maybe I can touch on what it means to me, because to be honest, I've never heard about this work until I moved to Australia, having lived in, all parts of the world. And I think the lack of diverse leaders in boards and executive teams, especially in Australia, are basically practical outcomes of, deeply, deeply rooted systemic issue. And Lee, when you talk about bamboo ceiling, when I look at corporate Australia, I actually see a bamboo sphere. So it's not just about going up, it's the surrounding environment where, we are trapped in a, multi-dimensional kind of sphere and bubble. And I do feel that in Australia in particular, the issue has not even emerged to the surface yet. A lot of people are not comfortable or actually very, very reluctant to talk about systemic racism, conscious biases, racial discrimination. So we're definitely way behind the rest of the world, when we look upon Black Lives Matter, all the anti-Asian hate activities, happening for the rest of the world. And looking at workplace, we don't talk about this at all. Is every day you think about this, you look around the workplace, there's something not so right, something don't sit well, but nobody actually raised their voice or talk about this. And when you talk about DEI, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, of course, people think about gender balance, sexual orientation, different abilities, which are all very important societal kind of problems. But cultural and ethnic diversity is at least 10 to 15 years behind the other movements and conversations. And looking at the financial services sector, I rarely see any Asians or any Asian Australians speaking at regional, local, national conferences or get featured in AFR, and all Asians panel like today is basically unheard of. And I think we absolutely need to talk more openly and frequently about this. So, glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's kind of discouraging to hear that it seems to be a problem in all of your sectors, but in different ways. So it's been really interesting to hear the different ways that the bamboo ceiling plays out and has consequences, but clearly it is an issue that needs addressing in sort of across all sectors. Thank you for that. Now I want to hone in on the corporate sector at first, and then I'll move to the other sectors. So Gloria and Seiji, that's the two of you. So I would just like to ask you briefly about any challenges that you've faced that you feel may have been related to your cultural or ethnic background or migrant experiences in your journey to, reaching the leadership positions that you have, and how did you address those challenges?
I'm happy to go first. Thanks, Lee. So the leadership expectation and even business model that I've observed in financial services sector, not just in Australia, is still, to your earlier point, very idealized the Western styles. There's only one style of leadership. There's only one style of doing things. And personally, my biggest challenge in my career is actually trying to stay true to myself and not to please not to prove, and try not to fit in. And my cultural upbringing actually gave me a lot of great qualities. I'm super adaptable, we're resilient, versatile, street smart, and book smart. Look at how many doctors we have here in this panel. But because of our resilience and the qualities that we have, which makes it very easy for me to project and assimilate. And I think working through that corporate ranks, refusing that temptation to do it easy is my biggest challenge. And I actually like to flip that around, turn the challenge into opportunity, because I'm a risk professional. So I'm actually hardwired to really identify blind spots and be unique. So I actually use my only voice to make a point a lot of times. So, and I always got the attention, like similar to what Stanley mentioned, when I enter the room, most often time I'm the only Asian, the only female, the only millennial, the only migrant with an accent. So, and as a risk professional, sometimes I have to, stay true and, stay strong with my voice. And I think really having that self-aware of my own strength and, the cultural intelligence that I bring really makes a difference in how I progress. And that consistency in delivery through, more than 10 years now, people would actually turn to me and hear what crazy ideas Gloria is going to have. It's always interesting thoughts, different perspectives, that is unheard of. So I think we just have to hold on to that uniqueness.
I love that. Thank you, Gloria. That's excellent. Seiji.
Yeah, I love that. It's really interesting hearing Gloria, hearing you speak about the kind of international angle, but also some of your points around assimilation and the importance of holding on to what's unique. As I think about this question, I think a lot of my challenges were earlier on in my childhood, in my youth. I was telling a friend actually a couple of months ago that you can track the evolution of my identity, at least the external perception of my identity, through the nicknames that other people gave me as I was growing up. And I wrote a list down. So when I returned back to Australia, I guess this would have been year 1 or year 2, I went to Cook Primary in Canberra, tiny place, about 100 people in the entire school. There would have been a very small number, a handful of Asian people. And people didn't know what to make of Asian people in a community like that. I also had a super whack haircut. I think I had this like really enormous sideburns and some kind of helmet style haircut. And people called me Black Elvis because I had a tan. I wasn't white, and people didn't know what to make of me. And so that was probably the first nickname that I had. The next nickname I had was I was the Chinese kid, because nobody really understood the difference between the different shades of Asia in a tiny community like that. In high school, some of my friends called me Jap. And then when I started traveling and backpacking, international communities would call me Jap Aussie. And so there were nicknames in between, but I found that interesting, that people's perception of me kind of changed. And you can see kind of like, it's also a story of how society has changed around us. I won't reveal my age, but primary school was a long time ago for me. But I think what I didn't do is hold on to my uniqueness enough when I was growing up. And I really felt this urge to suppress my Asian heritage and really just fit in. I would do anything to be Aussie. And my mum would make me Japanese delicious meals for lunch to take to primary school. And I'd throw them in the bin and buy a packet of chicken nuggets or a meat pie. Looking back, that's ridiculous. But at the time, you do anything just to hide the fact that you're Japanese. And I'd tell my mum, don't pick me up from primary school because you look different. And I'd get my dad to pick me up. And that would have broken my mum's heart, and she never talked about that until years later, things like this. In my professional life, happy to say it's an advantage, right? I can bridge cultures. To your point, Gloria, I am resilient, right? I've been through a bit, being bullied and ostracized as a kid. You learn how to hide enough when you need to, but then how to stand out and how to really relate to people. And so maybe I learned the hard way, but there is that confidence now that I can use to kind of have a competitive advantage in the professional workplace. But I do want to call out, I'm half Japanese, half Australian. Japan and Australia enjoy quite a lot of soft power on the global scene, and so this is a mix that maybe is a little bit different, dare I say exotic, but it's familiar enough for a lot of people that they can not be intimidated by me. That speaks to a larger point that Asian Australian, even that term, it's extremely inhomogeneous. And I have an experience that is, I'm sure, very different for every panelist member on here, being kind of half Japanese, half Australian, who did my professional life in California. And so I wouldn't dare to speak for kind of Asian Australians as a whole.
Yeah, no, it's fair enough. We all look quite different, and there is a lot of diversity in Asian Australians. So it's interesting to see the different experiences that we've all had. So, so Gloria, I wanted to move on to you as the chair of the Cultural Inclusion Employee Resource Group, or ERG, at NAB. And what motivated you to take on this role, and what are you doing in this role?
Well, thanks, Lee. There are a lot of things that motivates me to, drive inclusion and diversity at work. And I feel it's always kind of meant to be. And one thing that really stood out probably the first 3 months when I got here is because I'm kind of like the only Asian expat got, moved to Australia. So I'm kind of unique in a sense. And a lot of people actually reached out to me, oh, how do you get tap on the shoulder? And then at first, I don't know what that means because I work hard, but then I soon realized it's actually quite a common corporate practice. People get tapped on the shoulder a lot. Those are the real opportunities. And I see that as a massive problem, because if that is a default way to identify talent, make critical appointments, especially at a C-suite level, that practice actually disadvantages, obviously, certain groups of people, and especially highly skilled migrants, where we don't have the mateship, we don't have the established networks, we don't play golf on Sunday. And in my opinion, it's actually one of the biggest cultural inhibitors, leading to, especially in the financial services sector, the disparity in senior representation. So, my life motto is always, I'm not part of the solution, I'm part of the problem. So I always don't want to be part of that problem. And I'm just grateful to be working in an organization that I feel safe, empowered, and really well supported to be the agency to change. So, and I just took it. And I'm so fortunate that I work alongside a group of really amazing volunteers, change makers, with great support from also many executives throughout the organization. And our group actually design and, actually innovate a lot of many interesting initiatives to really bring and drive meaningful and also promising change for the organization, and also for financial services, because as I mentioned earlier, cultural diversity is probably at the end of the scale when people think about diversity and inclusion. So as I mentioned, I'm sorry?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just want to share a few key things that we deliver. Hopefully the audience can actually get some insights as to what we can do and collaborate going forward. So the first thing that we host, and a lot, is connection sessions. So in a variety of formats. So it could be speed mentoring, Ask Me Anything session, mock interviews, which actually create a lot of natural, open conversations between, executive and also across the sector. So it's not just about NAB. And then the second thing is we actually lead a lot of inclusion and diversity conversation with executive to be the trust platform, to create empathy, because we don't have that mutual understanding of our lived experience, and continue to raise awareness and also influence action and commitment, especially at the executive level. And thirdly, we collate a lot of data, not just quantitative, but also mostly qualitative, that a lot of people actually missed on, the lived experience, exit interview, and we do a lot of analysis to really highlight what are the learnings and understandings within our organization to highlight, key racial or cultural issues what exactly, how do we define the bamboo ceiling, for example, or the bamboo sphere that I mentioned within the organization. And lastly, we're all unique. Seiji mentioned, we're all Asian Australians, but we're so different. So also bringing in that intersectionality lens, like, Asian, by our own rights, we're all different. And we just have to continue to tear down very systemic barriers within. I'm a risk person, so I always go by policy and processes which drive human behavior. So we tackle that at a systemic level. And our objective is really to promote an environment where diversity is valued, represented, recognized, and rewarded, in all dialogue and also aspects. So Seiji also mentioned about, innovation, products, services. If we don't have the representation at the senior level, how can we make sure that we are actually innovating for the needs and objectives of our customers and communities? So that's always our business case and top priority.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Gloria. That's really inspirational to see like how active the ERG is being, and they're very lucky to have you as the leader of that group. You're very
Pleasure's all mine.
So perhaps just before we move on to talking about cultural diversity in politics, just quickly, Seiji, do you have any suggestions on an action that managers or organisation can take to address the bamboo ceiling issue, apart from, say, an ERG-led action?
Right. Yeah, I guess I think about this at two different levels. One is at the individual level and one is at the organizational level. At the individual level, it's important for leadership to be accountable for the actions that they take. And we hear a lot of leaders talk about cultural diversity and certain issues. But it's important that a few things. It's important that the action they take is visible to the people in the organization. It's important that we have the right metrics to kind of monitor and track what these people are doing. And when mistakes are made, that there's transparency. That's the only way we can hold these people accountable. At the organizational level, it's important that we have the right structures and the right framework to support making change. And I've got some pretty sensible examples, but I'll throw them kind of out and talk about one that is a little bit quirky. At my current workplace, there is a system called MemeGen. It's a platform that employees at my company can use, and they're encouraged to use, to create memes. And what ends up happening is that a lot of people turn to this platform to voice dissatisfaction with leadership and dissatisfaction with decisions made by the company. So I work for Google. And when Google is in the news for a decision that might not be favorable to some employees, people turn to memes and they create memes, they propagate them in the company, people vote on them. And there's a whole industry and a society around meme generation at Google. And people think this is fantastic and it's a bit of fun, but it's more than that. People turn to these memes to understand what kind of decisions are being made and who is accountable for these decisions. And leadership absolutely responds to these at company-wide meetings. And so that's one example of kind of like a structure that you can put in place to give people a voice.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Sorry, I would like to hear about the other things that you had to talk about, but we need to move on probably to Charisma and Stanley. So thank you, Seiji and Gloria, for sharing your thoughts on that. So Charisma, now cultural diversity in politics is a big issue at the moment. There's been the controversy over Tule in the federal seat of Fowler, which I'm sure that many people on this call are aware of. And I know that you've commented on this in a New York Times Australia newsletter, so well done. That was a great read. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts and experiences in this field. So first of all, can I just ask quickly, when you were growing up in Liverpool as a young girl, did you ever see yourself becoming a councillor? And also, perhaps similar to what I asked Gloria and Seiji, did you encounter particular challenges that might have been related to your background, and what did you do about them?
Sure. first of all, I can categorically say that I did not have dreams of becoming a counsellor when I was growing up. I think I would struggle to remember who were my local counsellors when I was in school and high school. I do remember though, when I was in high school, my council ended up getting put into administration for issues around corruption, I believe it was. So obviously not a great kind of example to refer to, but it was definitely not something that I thought I would do with my life. I was actually obsessed with natural disasters, so I always thought I'd end up being like a volcanologist or, you know, storm chaser or something kind of cool like that. But in terms of challenges, reflecting on Gloria and Seiji's responses, I think there's a commonality across different fields in that I've always known that I don't fit the mold, that I am quite different. And for me, I first got involved in politics and sort of you know, youth organizations and things like that when I was at university. And I first ran for office when I was about 24. So it was a real struggle to sort of marry what I saw as two very different identities. So I had always kind of practiced, you know, my culture. I did Indian traditional dancing for most of my adolescence, but I was very conscious that I couldn't be in sort of mainstream society, and especially as an elected representative, I couldn't be too brown or I couldn't be too ethnic. And that really influenced the way that I presented myself, the way that I spoke, you know, even the types of things that I posted onto my social media. And over the last couple of years, I've really sort of reflected, and maybe it's a question of age as well, as, you know, broader social movements. But I've really kind of felt that it's, in order to be more myself and more authentic and therefore more sort of true to my role as a public representative, it's very much about marrying those two aspects of my identity in terms of how I kind of fit in with mainstream society, but also, you know, the influences and the parts of my values and the parts of my my philosophy that comes from the way that I was brought up, and you know, cultural values as well. It hasn't always been sort of an easy road in that sense. I still remember I was, you know, I jokingly said that I potentially wanted to put my hand up for a leadership position when I was still at university. And I was told by the person I was speaking with that, you know, you're great, but I just don't think you have the right face. And that was definitely, you know, I definitely understood the message behind that comment. But also in terms of things like dressing and the way that you present yourself, you know, the last couple of years, I've really questioned why for the longest time I really struggled with things like, you know, wearing cultural dress at events and things like that, where politicians from an Anglo background are more than happy to present themselves in cultural dress and kind of use that as a tool to engage with different communities. That said, the fact that I do sit outside of the box and I'm not what people expect in a politician or in a local representative, I feel is a strength a lot of the time as well, because I'm able to kind of break some barriers when it comes to people putting politicians or putting representatives on a bit of a pedestal and therefore not being honest or not being able to express their concerns in a comfortable manner. So when people sort of see that I am visually, perhaps have a similar experience to them in terms of being from a migrant background or speaking a different language, or, you know, any of those challenges that, you know, multicultural communities experience, I feel that gives them, that gives us almost a sort of underlying language or an underlying way of communicating with each other that people sort of feel comfortable in making use of. And I think that makes me a better public representative at the end of the day.
Fantastic, thank you. It's so nice to be hearing these common themes of seeing cultural diversity as a strength, and sometimes that's something that which takes a while for us to really sort of develop that attitude towards ourselves. But that's really fantastic that you've come to that attitude, Charisma. Thanks. I I'm thinking that we are running a little bit behind schedule now. So if you don't mind, Charisma, I might move on to Stanley for now. If we get time, I can come back to you to ask another question, but sorry for that. I do want to allow time for the Q&A. So Stanley, I guess I would ask a similar question. Did you see yourself as becoming a school principal when you were younger?
No, I think any young child, I think there's a perception out there that to be a principal, you have to be old. So it's not even just a bamboo ceiling thing. I think there is also an age gap involved. But I think importantly, I always knew though, one day I might be a teacher. That was always a career option. I really enjoy this process of kind of empowering people. But, you know, among the Asian communities, to be honest, we emphasize a lot on education, but how many of us actually jump in and choose it as a career? And I've always found that really interesting, the discrepancy. But I think upon reflection, part of it is our own worries that, you know, many of our families came here for a different style of education, you know, whether or not it's better or not, that we leave that to individual judgment, but it's different. And so you're always a guest to the education system to some extent. And so there's always that question, you know, we came here for someone else's education. So how is it that we deserve to represent that education system and then be part of it and then to lead it? That just seems very far, I think. And so for me, no, the answer is no for principalship, but certainly teaching has been a really rewarding career. Yeah,
thanks. And I might ask you the next question sort of all at once, and you can pick out which parts you would like to address in just a couple of minutes. So did you face any challenges along the way to becoming a principal? How did you address those challenges? And also, how do you try to, in your role, encourage and support the leadership potential of teachers who are in your network, who are from culturally diverse backgrounds, and also the students that you're teaching? How do you foster their desire to become leaders in the future?
Right. I think something I actually really resonated with what Seiji said was, I feel like growing up here, there was a lot that I suppressed. And if not, I felt like there was always a compromise that I was making. But that didn't really mean much when you were a child until I think I entered the workforce. And, you know, I was one of those that Gloria mentioned. I was tapped on the shoulder at a very young age to lead Australia's largest language department. But in that job, I did realize that climbing up was almost impossible from then onwards. I saw the senior management of some of the best schools around the country, and was very clear they tended to be clubs of white men or women. They all shared some characteristics, which they tend to be very assertive, quite opinionated about different contentious topics in education, and often quite uncompromising. And this is very different to the kind of leaders, I guess, I grew up thinking were well respected in education, you know. And I think this speaks a lot to the cross-cultural differences in what it means to be a leader for different cultural groups as well. You know, I've always seen an educational leader being someone who is wise, and by wise I mean they're soft, because it's like Tai Chi. They know when to go hard, but when they need to be soft, they're soft. There's this kind of balance, and always knowing how to juggle both, rather than always only having the one dominant set of traits. And so certainly I think there was no role model, and I realized I was never going to join that club. And so there was a chapter in my career where I decided I need a break from Melbourne, because either I was going to change or this city was going to change, and one day we will come back. And I think it's certainly the case that I've probably come back at a time where a suitable opportunity arose for me. And so in terms of addressing that, and I even reflect upon how I got to my current job, I think one of the things I've always realized that as an ethnic minority, I had to work extra hard for the same opportunity. But then I started to turn that kind of negative, almost narrative around, to realize, actually, no, I've been waiting for particular positions that match my niche. You know, if I was to, at the stage I applied for my principalship at any school, I was probably not going to get it. You know, that kind of generalist built up of leadership experience, and you gradually work your way up, I was probably not quite there. But I have a specialty and expertise in language education, and that's something Abbotsford needed. We're the longest established Chinese English bilingual program in the country. This school was not just looking for any principal. If this school was going to be able to execute its next strategic vision, it really required someone who, yes, wanted the leadership challenge, but need to know something about bilingual education. And so, sure, to some extent, it might be seen as a compromise. I might not have as many opportunities on the principalship front, but certainly when the right opportunities came, I went for it. And, I wanted to demonstrate that I had the unique set of skills that they were looking for. So to some extent, my way of addressing it has been to never see that I have to fight in the same big pool, but to find where I can use my unique backgrounds to my advantage. So I think that same mentality then applies to how I encourage other Asian Australian leaders in my industry, as well as how we inspire students. To be honest, it's not about what you do and what you want to poke at, but in particular, I actually think for young kids, it's the fact that cultural diversity is the norm. How do we normalize it rather than how do we overcompensate for it is probably my mindset. If in my small school, they can see there's a diverse range of cultures represented, and that languages at my school, it's not about bilingual being only Chinese and English. Any languages is welcome. People we would like them to speak in their own languages to connect with each other. When that's just part of normal life, I think for sure, it will be in itself a very aspirational process for kids, whether it's about leadership or joining the educational force down the track.
Thanks so much, Stanley, and apologies for making you speak so fast.
Sorry.
Thank you for getting through that, all the questions. It's really interesting to hear your perspective on the education sector and cultural diversity there. So let's move on to the Q&A from the audience. Thank you so much to everyone for submitting questions, and great questions as well. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get through all of them today, but we'll choose a few. So one question which I might perhaps throw to Gloria first is, how do you identify the bamboo ceiling in your organisation and raise the issue to management without sabotaging your career?
Thanks for that question. Thanks. Oh, well, it's good that it's recorded, so I can play it to my exec. So I would say I've actually done a bit of research and, test different approaches suggested by, DEI experts. So I will share probably what works for me, given that I still have a job. So firstly, you really have to be measured, well rehearsed, and know your facts versus your personal stories. So get your facts straight. And then start the engagement with a very clear objective in creating a flow of communication. I've learned it the hard way. Never focus on singular. It's always a collective. And also always communicate rather than, talking at people. Sometimes, especially with different linguistic capabilities, we talk very fast. So a lot of times it can turn to be a you conversation rather than an us conversation. So, because one of the things that I've learned is you really have to level with them first to get their buy-in. Otherwise, they will never, you're just pushing them into the corner. So level with them, which is going to take a lot of time and a lot of space, but get them to a point where they self-realize where they are from a diversity perspective. Don't impose a standard on them, and let them self-realize and, just be there and support them to bring to the journey. And I think that works really well for me. Just from my internal and also working with other, corporate leaders, is that, patience is required.
Yeah, that's for sure. Does anyone else have any thoughts to add to that?
I guess one quick thought. So, the first thing to say is I agree with everything Gloria said. So it's a wonderful answer. One thought to add is, I tell a lot of people I work with, when issues like this and others come up, learn to play the game. And so I've worked in various different places, in academia, in startup life, in big tech. They're all extremely different places with different people, mindsets, mentalities, but also different rules and different levels of psychological safety where people sometimes feel silenced by leadership and sometimes they do not. And so it's really important, especially for junior people, to be very deliberate about understanding how decisions are made in their workplace and by leadership. And to Gloria's point too, be deliberate about the method and adapt it to where you are, and also pick your battles. And sorry, last point, kind of be clear with yourself what you will and won't compromise on. I think that's a really important one, and it takes time to figure it out.
These are all such great tips. Thank you. Thanks for these insights into how you can sort of go about making change without sabotaging your career. So Stanley or Charisma, did you want to add to that, or would you like to move to the next question? Charisma, did you want to? Okay, all right. So the next question that I have is, why do so many Australians deny that the bamboo ceiling exists? How can an Asian Australian prove their experience? So I'm not sure if any of you have come across this sort of situation and would like to comment on that. Perhaps, Stanley, I know that you're doing a lot of intercultural work. Would you like to make some comments on this?
Yeah, well, look, I don't necessarily think that many Australians deny that the bamboo ceiling exists, but I certainly think nothing super proactive is being done about it, or many people are feeling a bit powerless and there's not much in the toolbox to know as senior leaders what we can do to really shake things up. And so I think the question is quite tricky because I think most people are quite aware that such an issue exists, and I'd be keen to hear other people's thoughts around, what are the learnings we can draw from other types of inequities that industries have tackled, whether that's the representation of women, or we said sexual orientation and other things. Surely being an issue that's slightly behind in schedule, there are lots of learnings we can be transferring from those experiences.
Can I add to that response, if that's okay?
Absolutely, yeah.
I've been having some discussions in this space in terms of, how we can shift political representation and the diversity that we see within our political representatives. And one of the things that stands out to me, and I think it's really tied to this question of being very uncomfortable with the idea of a bamboo ceiling. As Stanley said, I think people are aware of it, but they're very uncomfortable about discussing it, about engaging with it in a constructive way, and also the potential sort of solutions or the potential measures to reduce the impact of the bamboo ceiling. And I think fundamentally it comes down to the fact that people often view, whether it's senior leadership positions in the corporate sector or in political spheres or in the community sector, it's viewed very much as a zero-sum game. So for there to be more people of Asian background or from multicultural communities in senior leadership positions, then other people have to lose out. And if that's the case, who is that? Who decides that? And how do we go about that? And I think it's further tied into this sort of furphy about leadership being a merit-based system, because if that's the case, then we would definitely see a lot more people of Asian background or from multicultural communities in our political spaces, in senior leadership positions, and in higher positions essentially. So I think breaking down some of the misconceptions that people have about who occupies power, how and why, have to be at the root of taking action, and without having some of those really challenging conversations and breaking down some of those preconceptions, I don't think we're ready for a broader conversation about the bamboo ceiling overall.
Thank you so much for that contribution. I'm really glad that you mentioned this merit-based view, and I think that's such an important element in the resistance, if there is any, to the bamboo ceiling. What's the idea of there being a bamboo ceiling? So thanks for those insights, Charisma. We are actually running out of time. We're over time at the moment, but I wanted to just, before I wrap up, ask one final question that everyone can respond to. And we might start with Stanley and Charisma. We'll go in reverse order this time. Stanley, Charisma, and then Gloria and Seiji. And you've kind of touched on this a little bit in the other question, but if you had to give one piece of advice to a aspiring leader who's from a culturally diverse background, what would that advice be? Stanley.
I think seeing, you know, I mentioned at the start, I love using the term Asian Australian to describe myself. And I think it's partly because I think the plurality means I've got something more than others. And how you use that to your advantage, I think it's a question that will have a unique solution for, you know, that'll be different for everyone. But certainly, I think seeing that as something resourceful and using it to your advantage and in whatever context it is. And I think that mentality for me is important because it's about staying true to yourself too. You know, if we are truly to become a society that can embrace the uniqueness of everyone in different elements, then we need actually people to stay true to themselves. So that's probably my advice. I think it pays off.
Thank you. Charisma.
Sure. So I've often used the phrase, you can't be what you can't see, to advocate for more diversity in leadership and political representation. And I think in terms of giving advice, I'd like to flip that and say, just because you can't see it doesn't mean you can't be it. I think research shows that people are more engaged when they see people with similar lived experiences, people who feel connected to, especially in political spaces, to be more engaged. And so if that is kind of holding you back, please don't let it, although that's a lot easier to say than do. And I think the other thing that I would say is, for every person that has said, you know, you don't fit the mold, you don't look like you belong here, there have been so many other allies who have actually advocated for me to put my hand up for positions, have, you know, paved the way essentially. So there will be supporters just as there are detractors. So please find your allies, find your supporters, and that will make a huge difference.
Excellent, thank you. Gloria.
So great advice. I'm still digesting what Stanley and Charisma was just saying. I would say, firstly, identify and respect your boundaries, you know, because it's going to be a tough fight. It's not easy, but, you know, just go for it. Like what Stanley said, if there's nothing that you feel like you can go for, create it. And also one last thing is never really internalize the negativity. You know, a no doesn't mean no forever. So just move on and continue to keep fighting. So.
Thanks, Gloria. That's very inspirational. And Seiji.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. This might be more pragmatic than inspiring. I'll keep it short. It's to pick your battles. I think sometimes we have to let stuff slide. As Asian Australians growing up in Australia, you can't pick every battle. And you have to have that self-awareness and understand when it's important to put your foot down, and that'll lead to larger change.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. I really wish that we could keep the discussion going and get through more of the questions, because they are wonderful questions that have been submitted. But I hope that at least with this discussion on, you know, we've all been able to get some insights from how the bamboo ceiling plays out across different sectors, but also the challenges that, you know, are quite common, even though Asian Australians are, you know, a diverse group of people. some of the experiences are common, like feeling like the odd one out when you go into a professional environment with leaders who, you're the only Asian person there. So that's sort of interesting to see those sorts of challenges, but also I think a common theme has been this feeling of diversity as an advantage and recognizing that and playing to that advantage. But I think also other people need to recognize it as well. And so some of the strategies, I especially liked what you said, Gloria, about the sort of step-by-step of how you can create change within your organization in an effective way. I think that's a really useful, practical approach that we can all take with us and learn from. So thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to the panelists, all of you. It's just been wonderful to get your insights. So Gloria Yoon, C.G. Armstrong, Charisma Kalyanda, and Stanley Wang, thank you so much for your time and insights. I'd also like to express my thanks to the Leadership Futures Hub for hosting this event, and also especially to Associate Professor Jeff Shao, who is one of the Hub directors, for being an instrumental part of making this event happen. Thank you also to Courtney Bowe and the team at Deakin who worked behind the scenes to make this go smoothly. And I'd like to note that this event is actually the soft launch of the Leadership Futures Hub at Deakin Business School. I'm a member of this hub, and we're really excited to be launching this new hub because it brings together academic experts and people from industry to solve the most pressing leadership issues that organisations face, and we hope to make a positive impact on society. So we do hope that you will join us for future events that are run by the Leadership Futures Hub. And finally, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for your patience as we've rushed to get through all of the interesting discussions and questions. I hope that you do feel inspired by the panel, like the panel discussion, the panelists that we have. We're really privileged to have these amazing panelists here share their experiences with us. And I do feel optimistic hearing each of you talk about, the future of leadership in Australia, that it can be more culturally diverse. And we just do need to keep these conversations going. We need to keep raising awareness. And find ways to implement strategies that can actually help to break the bamboo ceiling. So again, thank you all. Have a good evening. Take care and enjoy the end of the lockdown if you're in Melbourne at the end of the week. Thank you. Good night.